Welcome to Abolition Lessons here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Remember, there's no need to take an assigned seat. There will be no tests, no grades, and definitely no detention. All you need is an open mind. I'm your host, Irene Franco Rubio, and this is the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Today, we will be learning about the intersection of immigrant justice and prison abolition. Last time on the Schools Not Prisons podcast, we heard from Jose Arellano from Tepito Coffee and Homeboy Industries on his work in supporting formerly incarcerated individuals. Tune into that episode, subscribe to Schools Not Prisons, leave a review, and share with a friend. Today, we'll be exploring Silky Shah's book titled Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. Unbuild Walls dives into the relationship between U.S. immigration policy and mass incarceration, showing how the prison industrial complex and immigration enforcement are intertwined systems of oppression. Through historical and legal analysis, Shah's personal experiences, and stories of resistance, this book assesses the movement's strategies, challenges, successes, and shortcomings. Founded in 2016, Schools Not Prisons is part of a larger movement to examine the history of the prison industrial complex and how oppression in all its forms has worked to criminalize young Black and brown people across the United States. By centering abolitionist education for young people of color, we're exploring alternatives to incarceration, centering accountability, and co-creating a better world together. Before we get into today's interview, let's go over some vocabulary so we can really understand the story our guest is about to share with us. Our key term and concept to consider today is crimmigration. Crimmigration is the merging of criminal law and immigration law, leading to the treatment of immigration violations as criminal offenses and the increased use of criminal penalties against immigrants. This concept explores how the criminal justice system and immigration enforcement have become interconnected. The process through which immigrants are funneled from detention centers to deportation, often without due process or fair legal representation. This term underscores the systemic issues within U.S. immigration policy that prioritized removal over humane treatment and justice for immigrants. Today's guest is Silky Shah. Silky has been working as an organizer on issues related to racial and migrant justice for over 2 decades. Originally from Texas, she began fighting the expansion of immigrant jails on the U.S.-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11. In 2009, she joined the staff of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the United States, and she now serves as its executive director. Silky's writing on immigration policy and organizing has been published in Truth Out, Teen Vogue, Inquest, and The Forge, and in edited volumes of The Jail is Everywhere, Resisting Borders, and Technologies of Violence, and Transformative Planning. She has also appeared in numerous national and local media outlets, including The Washington Post, NPR, and MSNBC. Thank you, everyone, for being here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. I'm your host, Irene, and I'm joined by Silky Shah today, who is the author of the book Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. And I'm just so excited to have Silky here. So, Silky, thank you for joining us. It's honestly a dream come true to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, no, well, just for context for audience and listeners and why this is so important and how me and Silky even know each other. So I support Silky in the sort of production of the impact of this book, but more importantly, it's really an opportunity to get a public understanding of why prison abolition is so deeply tied to all the issues that we engage with. And so Silky has been leading this work for a long time and is really at the forefront of what immigrant justice and prison abolition mean. So yeah, it's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Well, I am thrilled to be here, and I feel so lucky to have all of your support, and I'm really excited to be in this space with Schools Not Prisons, and just grateful for the work that y'all do.
Yeah, thank you, Silky. Well, I'm super excited. I guess to give us a little bit of context before we even get to the themes of the book, can you tell us about who you are, where you're from, how you kind of show up in this work and how this came to be.
Yeah, I am, the executive director of Detention Watch Network, which is a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the U.S. I come from Texas. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, to Indian immigrant parents, and I grew up in Houston and a really, really vibrant immigrant community. And when I was in college, it was around the time that 9/11 happened, and so I was already kind of an organizer, activist student, and I was in Austin, but I was starting to learn more about the intersections of the prison industrial complex and immigration and seeing sort of the expansion of immigrant detention. So I started organizing around these issues, of course, Texas, where the death row capital of the world, and also after 9/11, where we saw a sort of prison boom happening after the creation of Department of Homeland Security. All those things kind of really informed the way I started understanding these systems. And so I started organizing especially to stop the expansion of immigrant detention in Texas.
Yeah.
And have been kind of on that journey for many years, and eventually joined the staff of Detention Watch Network in 2009.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think just when I first met you as well, I think it's important to note that it was so exciting to me. And I know I've kind of shared this with you before, but I think it's so important to like really center how, I guess, me emerging into the space as a sort of like newer generation of someone engaging in abolition and someone like yourself who's been doing it for so long. It was so exciting to meet someone who I felt like was doing it exactly how I was imagining it, but I didn't know who to go to or like seeing someone putting it into practice. And when I came across you and your book, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like what I've been trying to say or trying to talk about, trying to put together. And I didn't really know how to like make sense of it. But speaking to you, learning from you has really given me the chance to like, oh, wow, this is a thing that people are actually really thinking critically about. And you're encouraging people to like make this a way of engaging in movement. So I just wanted to bring that up as like, I just really appreciate you being someone who was willing to push the bounds in what movement can look like and challenging folks who I would say sometimes don't want to acknowledge the intersections of these things. And yeah, so it's giving me a lot of chance and opportunity to be like, this is something that is clearly true and is the path towards, a liberated world. So just thank you for that.
Well, that means so much to me. It's been really remarkable to have the book come out and see how much it's resonating with people. Sometimes working in this sort of in the immigrant rights movement, that there's like less of an understanding of these systems and this history, and sometimes it feels very, very isolating. I write about this a little bit in the book, and it's been remarkable. I do think the book is resonating with people who have seen the way that this is played out, especially in their communities, and feel sort of frustrated with the answers that we've been told are the way to move forward, and want to see something different. And so, that means so much to me. I mean, that was really my goal, is to kind of really make these connections so we could do better. We could do a better job of making the case to really not just stop the sort of inhumanity against immigrants, but to all people of color, poor working class people in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think to also contextualize for the audience, because since the first episode of Schools Not Prisons to now, we've talked about sort of at least my introduction, right, to this kind of work. And a lot of that, as you know, was in Arizona and this era of SB 1070. And I know I always talk about it, but I think about it a lot because that really set the stage for how I even started to think about abolition. And I think you growing up in Texas, I'm sure also was the framework for why you think about abolition. And I think what's so compelling about the way you approach it and the way someone like me is trying to learn it is like giving the space and the sort of freedom and opportunity to know that we can like challenge what we've been told is movement, right? Or what we've been told is, organizing for different issue areas, but never really thinking in tandem with each other. And so I say that for listeners to really think about, like, for when we started this podcast, it was trying to give everyone a chance to see what abolition was and how it plays a role in the world. And to now, I'm hoping from today to really kind of break down how it's actually very much interconnected with all facets of any movement or any social issue or any sort of circumstance that the state has imposed on our lives. And so I think from beginning to now on like really breaking down what abolition is to how it plays a role in our lives. Yeah, I think that's what this episode is intended to do. So just wanted to offer that as a way for our listeners to really start to ground this idea of it doesn't just affect one aspect of us anymore. It's not just, we've talked about community-based masculinities. We've talked about intersectional feminism. We've talked about the school-to-prison pipeline broadly. But really, it's a chance to get us to think more about how each opportunity in our life or lack of opportunity is all part of this larger system. So anyway, so to go back to you, I wanted to get a little bit more of a sense on why and how you've started to feel compelled by prison abolition as an avenue for thinking about the world, really.
Yeah. I mean, I came to it pretty early. So it was, like I said, after 9/11 and that sort of moment, I started learning more about the targeting of Arab, Muslim, South Asian communities after 9/11, really already having a sort of understanding what was happening in Texas in terms of the disproportionate number of Black people in the prison system. And those things started to kind of come together for me, and I started organizing around them on campus. I actually organized around a campaign for divestment from private prisons when I was a student, and later ended up taking a job with a group called Grassroots Leadership, which was based in the South and doing work around privatization and to sort of push a national student campaign. But at that point, we started to see this real like prison boom, like I said, at the border after 9/11. That's essentially what was happening. People were being locked up for crossing the border without documentation. There was, by 2004, immigration crimes had become the number one crime in the federal courts. And so we really started to see, I was like technically a criminal justice advocate, but everything that was happening, it was immigrants who were in these prisons. And so those intersections were always there, even if the way our movements talked about them were so siloed. And so, about the time that I was graduating, actually, like right before I started my job, I went to the Critical Resistance South Conference. There was a number of critical resistance conferences that happened during that period of time. And I went to the one in 2003, and it was just like kind of an epiphany moment. It was like, okay, actually, why do we have prisons? What's their purpose? What do they serve? And sort of started to really unpack that and see that actually, instead of preventing harm, they cause a lot more harm. And so at that point, I kind of really called myself a prison abolitionist. I was like, no, I don't believe prison should exist. And I continued to organize for many years in Texas, and then eventually left and, connected with Detention Watch Network during that period of time. And in 2009, I took on a job with DWN. And it was really during that time that it started to crystallize more not just abolition as a vision, but abolition as a guide, as a theory of change, as like a lens that we needed. Because so it was 2009, which was a really particular moment in our history where President Obama had just come into office, and there was a lot of hope, quote unquote, and belief that things were going to change. And this very intentional move on the administration to say, actually, we're going to fix the broken immigration system, quote unquote, broken immigration system. But what we started to see was that actually all the policies they put in place, whether it was alternatives to detention or risk assessment tools or other sort of reforms, actually only serve to grow the system, or even improving conditions, actually ended up having the federal government work more with private prison companies. And so what we saw was all the reforms just served to expand the system rather than really starting to chip away at it. And even on reforms that were attempting to get rid of those like really harsh worksite raids that we were seeing at the time, they tied it much more closely to the criminal legal system. And so the US, which has, the largest prison system in the world and this huge apparatus, more, even that much more closely was starting to be tied to it, and more immigrants were being funneled in, and more deportations were happening as a result. So
Mhm.
all the reforms only served to make the machinery larger.
Yeah.
And I think for me and for Detention Watch Network and our members and, you know, the people who were sort of seeing what was happening, we were like, well, why do we think, what do we actually believe about these systems, and are they really helping us? And maybe actually these systems can't be fixed. And so we kind of had this, at Detention Watch Network, there was this sort of vision of detention as a last resort. And we were just like, well, what does that mean? What is the last resort, and what is the scenario in which we should do that? And eventually, actually, during that first term of Obama, we started to really reckon with it. And by 2012, we became abolitionists. We believed that we came out with a vision of a world without detention. And, our campaigns, our strategies started to really, really sharpen after that. And that's for me a lot of what kind of helped me not just like say, okay, I don't believe in this thing. Actually, how do I understand this as a tool
Mhm.
to help us do better?
Right. And I feel like even just thinking about, as you reflect on the Obama era and it being really foundational, I think, for a lot of immigrant families, or at least just communities of color, seeing, positions of power suddenly seeming to be, racially diverse, and seeing this as an opportunity of like, oh, they're, like you mentioned, hope and this idea of possibility and this American dream.
Yeah.
I referenced that as a sort of setting the stage of what a lot of people were thinking in that time. And as you sort of reference ideas of reforms, it became really common for an everyday, working class person to see reforms as an actual avenue. How did you start to really sort of position this framework, knowing that a lot of people think of reforms either at that time and even now as an avenue of like, oh, this could be a solution, and reform meaning, trying to like keep the systems but not changing them, or rather keeping the systems but not getting rid of them. How do you, at least at that time and maybe into now, start to really, challenge members or community members to think critically about that's actually not a real solution, or it's not a solution that you think you have not seen be effective?
Well, I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I truly believe that if we are aligned and if our movements are interconnected and we have a real understanding of broader abolition, then that's going to help everybody. And what I saw in the Obama years, it was actually, there were sort of two things that happened that really started shifting people's thinking. One was because the Obama administration was much more closely tying the criminal legal system to the immigration enforcement system. The problems of discriminatory policing and mass incarceration were now things that immigrant communities could no longer ignore. Like, actually, that's how their loved ones were being targeted. And throwing a wrench in that was actually a really important part of the learning. And so that bigger picture started to become a little clearer, although there was still a lot of like innocence frameworks and other things happening in that context. But the other thing was that it was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, people were on the streets constantly protesting police killings in Ferguson and Baltimore, et cetera. And that kind of opened up space to say, actually, these systems are really racist. And then by the time we get to the Trump era, it was really interesting because I feel like the Obama period was so, the framework was really just the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. And we were always coming up against that. The sort of felons, not families, gang members, not grandmothers. It was just this like Obama narrative that, reinforced this idea. But during the Trump era, because, the sort of veneer was off, people actually, we had openings to say, no, look, the system itself is racist. The system is, its intention is to scoop up more and more people. And that's how it works. And that's what we've seen. And I think in 2020, which feels sadly very far away from this moment, that was our like the moment when we had the best case to make against immigrant detention. It was that summer of 2020 when the uprisings were happening that actually you started to see mainstream immigrant rights organizations say, actually, let's end detention. Why do we even have detention? And so, I think it was important that we had those campaigns starting back in 2012, and we started calling for shutdown, and we started sort of we started shifting from here are the conditions problems, but actually this is the systemic problems that we're seeing, and how the system is growing and growing and growing. And so a lot of that stuff was embedded, and there was more and more local organizations and hunger strikes in detention and work happening in communities to target specific detention facilities. So a lot of that like foundation was really built. And then in those moments when we had an opening, like the summer of 2020, we could get people to move. And so a lot of what I'm arguing, and I write about this in the prologue of the book, is there are going to be various catalyst moments. In 2020, it was the pandemic. It was the uprisings around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other murders that happened by police. But it was also, in September 2020, there was the story that blew up about forced hysterectomies and gynecological procedures on women detained at the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. And all of those things got people to pay attention. And it was important for us to be ready to say, okay, you see what this system is. The response isn't just making this a nicer cage. The response is actually shutting this down. And we started to see things really shift after that point. And so I think that is an important way to sort of think about abolition as both a, like it's a call to action, but it's so much of that spade work, that work where you're constantly doing to base build and build our sort of community work against these systems, and being really prepared in those moments when we can move the needle.
And in the book, I really appreciate you breaking down what these catalyst moments mean and why they're so important. But getting to that point is kind of not necessarily a waiting game, but it's being prepared or preparing in terms of thinking and organizing to get to that point. And even as you get there, what it has me thinking about is you sort of reference the, from the Obama to the Trump era, from 2008 to 2020, like how the narratives started to shift over time. And by this meaning the sort of good immigrant, bad immigrant, the anti-Blackness that emerges, all that sort of stuff that really kind of positions us to basically kind of, sort of see each other as the enemy rather than this sort of larger power or the state as the actual enemy. Can you share a little bit more about how from the catalyst moments to the good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative sort of play a role together, and how that started to be something that you, one, understood that there was a narrative that was sort of contradictory to communities of color that were experiencing oppression together, and then how, that is important in addressing first before getting to a catalyst moment that's just requires the real sort of assessing on these ideologies before getting to a moment where it was, too late, I guess, at that point.
Well, I think there's a lot to point to in the history of this that I think helps people understand the systems more. And I think that was really important. Like, I think the Obama era was a period of time where, the other thing I didn't mention, it was also like a really incredible rise of the immigrant youth movement that led to the passage of, or leading to President Obama implementing Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. And that was a lot of people, standing up for themselves and not accepting the narrative. So the narrative constantly was, we came here as no fault of our own. We're valedictorians and we're soldiers, or whatever they wanted to say. But actually just sort of like rejecting that narrative and just being like, no, like actually we're going to fight for ourselves, and we're going to fight for our parents, and we're going to fight for our communities as a whole, and really debunk these good versus bad immigrant narratives. But I also think so much of it is about, and I do this in the book, really telling a story of how we got to this point. And so much of it is built on these very particular moments that are very connected to how we got to having the world's largest prison system, which, in 1980, when this modern detention system started to really come together, it was actually anti-Black racism that really started to build it up. It was a response to Haitians arriving by boat in Florida and being deemed economic refugees, not deserving of asylum, and being systematically detained, indefinitely detained. And when you know, there was lawsuits against the government said, okay, well, because it seems so racist, we're going to actually just apply this to more migrants and apply it to Central Americans and other people who are Coney, who are fleeing U.S.-backed wars in the region. We also see the expansion of mandatory detention, especially through the war on drugs. And so these things are all very, very interconnected. And then, of course, after 9/11, it was the war on terror, which really people understand in terms of what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and abroad, but also domestically, the war on terror operated through the criminal legal system. And so I think it was so important for there to be a process of really recognizing the policies and the failures of our government to respond to community needs. Of course, this is the rise of neoliberalism. We see more and more people, more stratification of society. And so I think all of that, history and understanding helped people sort of see what was happening and not sort of fall into that. I mean, I think there's a lot more work we have to do. And I think that's a lot of the reason why I wrote this book, because people kind of fall back into that narrative. It's a really easy narrative to be in the we are not criminals, we are not terrorists, et cetera, mindset. And, in so many ways, I think in a moment like now when there's been a backlash, it's like easier to even sort of go in that direction. But I think it's like really holding that line and helping people unpack the reasons why immigrants are scapegoated. So I think that's the other thing to sort of push in this moment, which is, I think there's a lot of destruction of social safety nets and people feeling a lot of anxiety about the economy or housing or climate or other things. And I think politicians often position immigrants as the scapegoat and kind of ignore the fact that it's actually the government failing at helping people in need, at providing for our communities. And so trying to just give some of that context and, push to stop the dehumanization, because the more and more we see now is actually the dehumanization. These systems kind of normalize this. And I think it's our responsibility to kind of really push back against that and say, we if we're in this together, if we actually are fighting for all communities, it's going to help everybody. So instead of pitting communities against each other, and I think especially this happens in the immigrant rights world, it's like there's so much of this like exceptionalizing immigrants, and like one of the things that comes up a lot is this like stat of immigrants commit less crimes than U.S. citizens, and often what it ends up serving is like reinforcing anti-Black racism, because when you look at the prison system, Black people are disproportionately locked up. But it also reinforces this idea that immigration is a public safety issue, which it's not. It's about family, it's about refuge, it's about opportunity, it's about labor, of course. And so trying to really not just fall back on these, common narratives and really start to unpack it and think about ways we can disrupt them.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that quote, because that's actually, I heard that first from you, and I never really kind of considered, why is it that it's always like, oh, well, then we're not criminals, or like we're not doing what they're doing. And it's like, why was no one ever really trying to like, realize the faults in that, and instead want to think, oh, what are more inclusive ways to actually, think about, pathways to citizenship for one group of people, but also the liberation of not being incarcerated for others. Why do you feel like, as you started to really engage in this movement, those things were isolated from one another? So Silky, so you incorporate personal experiences and stories of resistance in your book. Can you share a particularly impactful story that you feel illustrates the struggles of those affected by these intertwined systems?
Yeah, I actually start out the book with the story about a man named Jesse Jerome Dean Jr., who was from the Bahamas, and he actually was incarcerated in, I believe, in the 1995, early 90s, for drug trafficking. He claimed innocence, so he didn't take a plea deal, which ended up meaning that he got 30 years sentence in federal prison. So he was in prison for years, and he was from the Bahamas. His son was 8 years old whenever he was first imprisoned, and he had been transferred to a number of facilities. And the thing about, there was this whole category of prisons in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for people who were non-citizens, because the idea was that people who were immigrants were going to eventually be deported after they served their time. So they created these sort of like stripped down facilities that had not as, adequate medical care, other services for people who are even in prison for a long time. I mean, again, he had a 30-year prison sentence. And so he's in these really, really horrible conditions for many, many years. And then finally in 2020, at the end of 2020, he was supposed to be released and hopefully be reunited with his family in the Bahamas. And he was really looking forward to it, and his family was too. And he, because he was a non-citizen, he was actually, upon release, was transferred to Immigration and Customs Enforcement custody and ended up in a county jail that ICE rents bed space at in Michigan. And it was terrible. He was like deteriorating. He was having really horrible stomach pains and was asking for help from nurses, and they just really ignored his requests. He had lost 17 pounds. They said he was quote unquote interfering with staff duties. And then eventually he died after, 4 or 5 weeks in ICE detention. And I remember learning about his story and just being really, really devastated. This is somebody who spent not just years in incarceration, but then ends up in ICE detention. And I think that's something that, a lot of folks don't realize. It's essentially, quote unquote, double jeopardy. You're punished twice for these situations, and eventually banished and deported. And but the conditions are so bad, and that's what we saw for so many years, more and more deaths in all these facilities. And so I think that's a story that sort of reflects that if we only try to do the work to say immigration should be separated from the criminal legal system, we're kind of missing parts of the system in the ways that immigrants are targeted at all different layers. There's all these layers of punishment, and it's not just DHS, it's not just ICE, it's obviously Customs and Border Protection, but it's also the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Marshals and all these local police and county sheriffs. And so there's so much that is involved here, and part of the reason why it's important to have an abolitionist lens.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think it's really playing and explaining this idea of double punishment. I think even situating it as like, you're going to receive even more harms because of what we see as like a real criminal or someone who's really imposing harms on the state, even though no one was. On that note, how did learning about that story and just the narratives that you've encountered start to inform the activism and organizing that you started to do from there?
I think that so much of the way we've approached, or how we approach these systems, is sort of like focused on the individual. So like, policies like alternatives to detention, which in the context of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE detention, immigrant detention, is often either ankle monitors, GPS tracking, sometimes with smartphones, sometimes now with wristwatches, that just started to expand the system, and were sort of alternative forms of detention because they were these like surveillance models. But the idea was like, oh, this is going to help this individual not be in prison, which I get, like, you don't want people to be in these conditions. So the thing about, um, the way we approached it was often like, how does this help an individual? What are some tools we can have? There was this risk assessment tool that was really proposed that was going to like assess if somebody was worthy of release. But what we saw is that it just actually made the machinery larger. So I think part of what learning about stories like Jesse Dean or people who have had interactions with the criminal legal system and immigration system was kind of looking at the systems as a whole and how do we actually put forth reforms, non-reformist reforms or abolitionist steps that are going to start to chip away as opposed to sort of try to help one person, sometimes at the expense of other people.
Yeah.
And so I think that was such an important lesson in all of this is like, no, actually, we can't just kind of get rid of the quote unquote bad apples in the police department or in DHS. It was actually about putting forth abolitionist steps that said, this whole detention center, like, no, this has to go. We have to start shutting this down or not putting forth ideas of, oh, these individuals who are innocent are much more deserving than other people, because what we understand about these systems is that they serve to expand the scope of who can be brought in. And so innocence doesn't actually help that frame. And what we really need to do is sort of go after the core of why the system exists in the first place.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the centering of this is collective liberation, or it can only happen for the entire, taking down or shutting down an entire detention center, not just thinking about one particular individual's experiences, but using those experiences as opportunities to sort of get public understanding as to why it's so important or as to why it's so impactful, and seeing that as avenues similarly to folks who are incarcerated in prisons, as this is part of a larger system and the different ways that people are being criminalized, pitted against each other, being forced to assume one group is better or worse than the other, when in reality it's like the state wants to incarcerate and oppress everyone at the same time. I guess, how did you start to either push in the spaces you were organizing in or folks around you to really see this as, we can't be isolated anymore in what we're saying, whether our narratives that we're pushing or who we're supporting, but rather really getting folks to understand like the whole spectrum of what's actually happening on a much broader level beyond just like one particular, community or one particular city or state or however that looked? How did you start to really position that framework? So can you tell us a little bit more about, in your organizing, how you started to either encourage folks in movement with you to start to think about the connections of these different issue areas and starting to see it as a sort of collective push for everyone's liberation instead of sort of one particular individual or one particular issue area that the state was imposing on communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of struggle to get folks behind abolition in this context. And, part of often what we do, it's like a combination of, base building, like doing a lot of work to bring more organizations in to sort of see and understand what's happening, and really thinking about the different strategies, whether it's a organizing strategy or advocacy with elected officials or narrative work to sort of shift the conversation. And sometimes it's research too. So one example is in the state of New Jersey, there was actually, a big effort to shut down detention centers there. And New Yorkers had been detained in New Jersey for a long time at a county jail called the Hudson County Jail. And a lot of, what people did was to make sure to help the people who were detained at the Hudson County Jail was actually get city funding to provide legal provision, legal services to people who were detained there. And in 2018, when there was this really big push around Abolish ICE, and it was the period of time where there had been family separations imposed by the Trump administration, the state of New Jersey, well, not the state of New Jersey, but the Hudson County actually decided to end the contract with ICE, which was amazing. We were really excited about this. But a lot of attorneys and people in New York and even in New Jersey came out and said, no, we want to keep this detention center because the detention center being here means that we can help people here. And their concern was really about this question of people being transferred to other detention centers. And this comes up a lot in the context of conversations around prisons. I mean, prisons and detention centers and jails are often in remote areas, really far from family and community and other services like medical services or legal services. So it's understandable why people are concerned about it. But we were also concerned because the way that ICE operates, it often targets people just by having people in, like having a jail nearby. So one example that we kind of uncovered was that in Southern California at the Adelanto Detention Center, which had opened up during the Obama administration in San Bernardino County, after that facility opened up, ICE arrests in the county like skyrocketed, and it became the #1 place for ICE arrests in the country. So we started to see that actually having more detention capacity in a certain area actually impacted the number of people who are targeted in that community. So from our perspective, actually ending that contract, because detention is completely arbitrary. ICE makes very arbitrary decisions about who can be detained and who doesn't end up being detained. So after, potentially ending a contract, ideally less people would be targeted in the area. And that's basically what we've seen in a lot of these instances where contracts have ended. But it was really a battle in New Jersey because I think these folks had these, government funding to support people in detention. They're like, no, we can't do this. And, abolitionist scholar, activist James Kilgore has coined this term carceral humanism, which sort of gets us at this idea that jails or prisons are places for social service provision. And a lot of times you see jails being like, oh, we're providing mental health services or drug services or things that actually are public health questions, and sort of ignoring the fact that actually just by being in jail, by being in prison, there's a lot of harm that's happening. And so, I think our strategy in that moment was to both sort of come up with some resources and do some research to show, actually, no, like if you end this contract, that's going to help communities in New Jersey, help communities in New York that are being locked up in this facility. But it was also so much about building that base of support and pressuring those elected officials. And what was sort of remarkable is that in that period of time, there was like another vote on keeping the Hudson County jail contract. And, it was during the pandemic, and I think like 100 people spoke up saying, no, end this contract. We really want you to end this contract. And they decided to keep the contract because they thought they were doing a good job and because they wanted the money from ICE. But within 6 months, after so much organizing and so much work and so much to sort of push this idea, actually, just by having this facility there, you're hurting immigrant communities. They actually ended the contract and people aren't detained there anymore. And there's so many fights continuing to happen there, but I think it just shows actually, and even those, lawyers and other folks actually started to come around on this question, especially in the 2020 moment. And so I think it reveals that, there's a lot about these systems if we, again, just focus on the individual and don't see the impact of the system on the whole community. Sometimes we're missing a piece of the puzzle. And also it shows that if we expand who we're engaging with, I mean, it was so many different partners, so many people who came in, and organizations really saying, no, we don't want this. And it was that base building, that work that really got us to that place.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing this carceral humanism thing, because when I first learned about it was from you actually, or in space and community with you. And it really was startling to me in the sense of how interesting of being able to frame a narrative that there would be a need for prisons. And sometimes, right, I have heard narratives on like people preferring, if someone is unhoused, to be incarcerated because of having the access or being in a space and the things and services it could provide, which rightfully so. But I struggle with this idea of, should there be no prisons, then we could have, actually have those services available, right? We wouldn't have to go to a prison to get them. And I'm wondering what you think about like situating this narrative towards like a world without prisons would allow us to, again, experience less harm. But what about for folks who say, in this case, people who are in a rural community where a prison is bringing in a lot of jobs? I think that's a big question I hear. What does that community, what should that community do or think or start to sort of try to position themselves as, because it's sort of a contradiction of the government is able to provide and has large amounts of money to fund and allocate to prisons and police. So I guess that's where I'm kind of struggling, and I still don't really know the answer to be honest. So I'm wondering if you have any insights on this.
I mean, I think that's what's the sort of one of the like amazing things about learning about abolition and the sort of history and the growth of this system. Yes, it was a backlash to the civil rights era and to Black Power movements, and that's when we started to see really the rise of the prison industrial complex. But it was also a shift in the economy and the growth of neoliberalism, and so many counties and rural communities in the 80s and 90s really started to see prison building as economic development. Manufacturing was in decline. A lot of other things were happening in that period, and hundreds of prisons were being built as economic development. And I think that is an important part. I mean, that is probably one of our biggest struggles when we're trying to advocate against a detention center is we're going to make money off of this. Like local counties are really dependent on these dollars and they're lucrative contracts. And it's not, I think there's this narrative, it's so much about the private prison companies, but actually even then a lot of the times when politicians are supporting private prisons, it's because their local community has a private prison and those people are dependent on the jobs in that community. And so I think a lot of what has opened up for us, especially in the sort of like defund the police moment and really understanding how much money is going to both the mass incarceration, the carceral state, but also the war machine and military contractors and all of that is why do we have so much of our money going to these things as opposed to the services that our communities need, whether it's education or healthcare or housing or et cetera. And so I think that has opened up a lot of space. And actually in California, it's really been amazing to see there's been so much actually interconnected movement around the budget to save lives and groups like Californians United for a Responsible Budget and the Dignity Not Detention Coalition and other groups really pushing this divest invest framework. And through that, they actually passed this thing called the HEAL Act that provides $5 million to counties that are actually considering shifts away from immigrant detention to offer some, workforce training, job training, and other things to community members. So what does it look like to have healthy economies that are not dependent on incarceration, that support our communities? And I think that's really emerging more. I think this is like a really long-term strategy, but it's important to have those conversations now and really think about how we move away from constantly throwing more and more money at these systems that do harm.
So Silky, can you share with us a little bit more about how your book suggests that we can shift our focus towards abolition and what that could look like in practical terms, in terms of steps people can take?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the last part of the book, which is called Making Abolition, a lot of it is about really using abolition as a lens and understanding. And there's a few different questions I ask that we had actually fashioned after Critical Resistance has a couple charts about reformist reforms versus abolitionist steps. And so, it's really like asking yourself, is this step going to reinforce the ideas, reinforce the system, or is it going to start to chip away? Is it doing something that's going to potentially hurt other communities in the process. And so I think those are really important questions to ask yourself. And not only because it helps us kind of discern, but also we have such limited resources and capacity as our movements. We actually have to spend time on those things that are going to have the most impact. And, a lot of what I'm arguing in this book is that the local strategies, the work that happens in communities to start shifting people's ways of thinking about this and saying, no, we want to end the ICE contract with our local jail. We want to stop ICE police collaboration and end these sort of federal programs that target more communities. We want to, in Texas and Arizona and other places, for instance, there's all these sort of bills that are anti-immigrant that are more and more closely tying the criminal legal system and immigration system and using the criminal legal system to prosecute migrants. And if we just say this is an immigration bill, we're actually missing the point that actually it's the criminal legal system that, again, is the apparatus by which this happens. And we have to understand our strategies around that. And so I think it's a combination of really focusing locally, really focusing at the state level and trying to push those things, because once we do that, and this is what we saw around detention, we had, 20 plus states where people were waging campaigns either to end detention contracts or stop the expansion of new ones. And that started to change the national conversation. And politicians started to be like, well, why do we detain people? And we saw at the state level, at the local level, even at the federal level, more than 20 detention contracts end after we had like massive pushback at the local level and then also at the federal level saying, divest, defund this system. And so I think it has to be a combination of tactics, and everybody has a different role, whether you're somebody who, likes to door knock and wants to help build a base, or maybe you're good at graphic design, or maybe you're good at communications, or maybe you want to do legal service provision or provide services to community members or help build up mutual aid for community. All of us have different roles that we play. And so I think for me, what I'm saying is, yes, abolition's the vision, but if, you have to do something. We all have to do something. It's about organizing. It's about pushing the system. And then I think, not falling into that idea that immigration is its own issue. It's actually so intersectional, and that makes it kind of overwhelming because it's connected to all these other issues. If things get better on housing or healthcare or other things, hopefully that will help immigrants. And I think we need to really understand our movements as intertwined. And so instead of sort of pushing this idea that immigration is just a Latina issue, it actually affects like a lot of communities and being together in this. And of course, Black migrants are disproportionately targeted by the system every day because that's how the system was set up and it operates. And, in those moments when we've ended detention contracts, often those jails have stayed open and they find another population. And so making sure that actually our efforts to do this are from the beginning, really working with those community partners that are fighting for abolition or reforms in the criminal justice arena, and seeing how we don't end up just recycling these facilities. I mean, this is what we saw during the Trump era, where the state of Louisiana, for instance, actually had some criminal justice reforms implemented. But then because there was this sort of these empty beds and the economies were struggling, they were looking for other people to detain. Trump swooped in, and we had Louisiana ended up expanding to 6 more detention centers because of these empty beds. And so it's so important for us to actually connect, because if we don't, we kind of miss a piece and other communities are impacted. So I think that's, for me, that's so much of it is really focus locally, focus on what's happening in your community, focus on state level wins. That's where we started to actually shift the conversation, the implementation of sanctuary policies that prevented immigrants from being targeted by police in their communities. And we have, I think right now so much of it is defending a lot of that and making it even broader. And then also trying to bring back some of that humanization. It's been a really, really tough moment. There's been so much backlash. And especially because politicians have moved so much to the right on this issue. And so it's really going back to the basics. How do we, you know, offer know your rights trainings, make sure that we're protecting people from deportation, individual deportation defense campaigns, while also calling for shutdown of detention. We have to do kind of all of it, and really again, doing those things that are going to chip away and help our communities in the process.
No, I love that. I think giving folks, one, a comprehensive understanding of there's space for everyone to contribute to this movement. It's a timely moment for everyone to be doing something. And I'm curious to hear how you feel like, particularly leading up to the election, knowing things do happen at a state and local level, just how critical these ideas and these conversations are to put them into practice. What purpose do you think your book, these sort of frameworks on intersections, can do, or really start to push the public to situate themselves as part of a solution, that people can start to really think the sort of like the critical moment that we're in, that everyone can definitely do something about? Do you have any sort of insights on, whether alluding to themes from the book or practices that you're thinking about for yourself, that we should be thinking about in this moment?
Well, so much about this political moment we're in has been defined by the panic around what's happening at the border. And so the intent, I've talked a lot about the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. We're really in a sort of like old immigrant versus new immigrant moment where the sort of consensus is, well, we can do things for people who live here, but we have to keep other folks out. And part of then what happens is that there's more and more dehumanization of immigrants that ends up actually hurting the case that we're making for people living here and those who are seeking refuge. And this is by design, and this is something that both political parties have been pushing for decades and have thus in the process, by building up the border patrol, by building up prisons at the border, by working more with military contractors and really expanding sort of the reach of the military at the border, have manufactured a crisis in the border region. So I think we have to do a really good job and do our best to sort of counter that narrative and say, no, actually the way that the US government approaches this, the restrictionist policies are making all of this worse and hurting our ability to not just help people, but also counter this narrative by the right.
Yeah.
And I think it's been such a huge challenge because, Governor Greg Abbott, the governor of my home state of Texas, has really played into all of these narratives, and by busing migrants to sanctuary cities, actually sort of revealing how a lot of the social safety nets have sort of deteriorated and people are struggling, and it's made immigrants a scapegoat.
Yeah.
And so all these communities are now saying, oh, well, we can't help immigrants because we have needs ourselves. But because our federal government, our state governments, our local governments invest so much in the prison industrial complex, they're not investing in housing and education and nutrition and all the other things people need. And so just trying to really unpack that and say we need to understand that mass social inequality is the problem. It's not immigration. And if we had solutions that move towards helping both people here and those people who are coming, we'd get to a lot better of a place instead of just constantly investing in prisons and policing.
Yeah. No, I think just thinking about it as again, roles that we can all play, but rather there are larger implications that are happening or will be happening, heading towards the end of 2024. And as we think about what the next 4 years can be and the harm that can be caused, but the role that we can play in trying to prevent it. And I say that as a way for us to think more about this abolitionist world is a sort of long-term goal that is not going to be met tomorrow or this year or next necessarily, but there are steps that we can all take or at least start to practice or think about to get there. And so I'm wondering, one, what does an abolitionist world mean to you? And I guess, too, because you're so much deeply committed to doing this work, how can we try to get there?
For me, abolition is a process, and it's a sort of a constant push to really reflect on the systems that we have now and how they're harming our communities, and how we can look towards a world where prisons aren't the norm and police are not the norm. Like, actually, we have systems where people are thriving and are taken care of, and we're preventing harm throughout creating even more harmful systems. So for me, an abolitionist world is something that we create by taking these steps every day through making abolition, which I say in the book. And for me, so much of the strategy of how we get there is staying true to our values. And, there's going to be short-term strategies and long-term strategies. And, often there's going to be compromises in this, but it's so important that we fight for everyone and fight for the whole and not just a piece of the puzzle, right? We actually have to look at the worldview from a holistic place. And so if we can hold on to that and really stay grounded in migrant justice and racial justice and really fight for everyone through, our campaigns, our strategies, our narratives, then I think we'll start getting closer to it.
No, I love that. I think it's precisely what I've tried to either center in how I approach this work as well, or really make a point on this podcast that I hope listeners will take away, that the whole purpose of this is not only to examine the history of the prison industrial complex and what it means and what it does, but rather, like, a liberated world is one that requires everyone's liberation, and one that includes every sort of circumstance and the role that the state plays and all the ways that it does, and seeing it as like, how can this be achieved collectively and not, for the sole experience of one particular person or group or, population. So I just really appreciate you bringing us back to, at the essence, like, remaining grounded in the values that have guided us up to this point of what movement building means and what organizing means and what justice means. Because I feel like oftentimes we can forget in the process, right, of this process of abolition. It can be so hard to actually try to see it or visualize it or get close. So yeah, just thank you for centering it as something that, in all aspects of the work that you do, that requires all of our liberation to be kept in mind. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I, part of the reason why I called it Unbuild Walls was both about that sort of like very physical unbuilding the prison, jail, detention center, border walls, all the walls, but also it's about unbuilding the walls that are between our movements for social change that prevent us from seeing actually how some of our strategies have hurt other movements. And so for me, so much of this is about being interconnected and
my main takeaway from today's episode with Silky Shah was understanding that a gilded cage is still a cage. We explored ideas of carceral humanism, which suggests that there is a need for prisons and having services offered to folks who need it. We explored a variety of themes in Unbuild Walls. We also explored the problematic narrative of carceral humanism and how it creates more harm than good. Thank you for tuning in to the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Like, comment, share with a friend. The Schools Not Prisons podcast is produced by Revolve Impact, an award-winning social change creative agency and content studio, in partnership with Mordida Studios. This podcast is produced by myself, Irene Franco Rubio, Mariela Rosario, and Mike De La Rocha. In this episode of Abolition Lessons, we explore the intersections of the immigrant justice and prison abolition movements and how they are interconnected through Silky Shah's book, Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition.